3 times last year, my father was carried on a stretcher to the emergency entrance of the Englewood Hospital, and each time his 80-year-old heart nearly failed him. During one vigil, when once again we were both pretending sleep, I studied how moonlight, slipping through the blinds, scored his blanket with silvery threads, and feared thereafter I would tremble at such a gentle sight. What was Father thinking? Reading my mind, he whispered, "Betty, lying here, I recall riding the trains during the war. They stopped often. Perhaps they had run out of coal or wood or water. Perhaps a bomb had torn up the rails ahead, or a bomber was near. Perhaps the engine or the conductor merely needed a rest. Never was there any announcement on why we had stopped, or when we might get going again, or what would happen if we had to get off. There was nothing to do but wait and hope. How still that darkness, how shrill that silence. It is the same now." He had never mentioned the trains before, and suddenly I wanted to shout, "Father, what else haven't you told me?" But of course, I did not. Mercifully, those vigils have ended. Father is well again, with the help of a cane and the blithe carping of my energetic mother, who long ago decided to dismiss age, his and hers. He even clambered up a slope of the White Mountains to attend a Lord wedding this summer. Side by side, they stood at the summit, watching the sun drag its shimmering net across the lake, cradled in the grasslands below. I embraced them. To my touch, Father, the former collegiate champ who dove off of high boards and drove his teammates down basketball courts, felt as transparent as a crystal wine glass. Mother, the enduring beauty, who had never taken a single swipe at a ping pong ball, much less a medicine ball, felt as fragile as Schwarzenegger. To me, they were the most winsome couple who had ever come from far and near to celebrate the bonds of matrimony. Today we have resumed our normal family life, detesting the telephone, visiting whenever possible, enjoying each other's company always. But I'm still not free of that panic I had felt racing through the maze of starkly lit hospital halls. Sometimes an unanswered ring will trigger it, sometimes a smile in a photograph. More often than not, nothing at all. Then between one breath and another, panic, as hot as lava, is suddenly injected into my veins. Suddenly, I'm running again. Down endless halls. My heart drums, the din echoes, ricocheting off of those leaden institutional walls. I must reach Father, reach Mother, I must. No, not yet. I can't face them just yet. I must have more time. I'm not ready. I'll never be ready. But despite such seizures, I still have not asked, "Father, what else haven't you told me?" I refrain, not because questions are forbidden. I refrain because we have a tradition at home. At home, the telling is unbidden. Accordingly, the scene hardly varies. Mother and Father are seated at a table, crowded with dirty dishes and 2 steaming cups of tea with the leaves floating, or 2 cups of coffee laced with a dollop of cream and a heaping spoonful of sugar. And until the Surgeon General's historic report, there was a huge ashtray between them, overflowing with burnt matches and butts, half tainted with lipstick, half without. The time can be any hour between dusk and dawn. Listen, and the stories will flow. I listened. The earliest such table I can positively identify was the folding card table which, when erected, produced gridlock in the tiny Brooklyn apartment we fondly recall as our first American home. From my gerrymandered bed, cushions appropriated from the sofa and pieced together at the bottom of the walk-in closet, I used to eavesdrop. The current table is round, made of cherry wood, and seats 12 thigh to thigh on holidays. It stands underneath a chandelier in a suburban dining room. While I, too, have been elevated. From a seat facing the kitchen door, I no longer just listen, but tell as well. And I interrupt and interrupt and interrupt. Between these tables, there were others. I cherish each and all. They were the sites where stories were told, the stories that are as intrinsic to me as my backbone, the stories that guide my earthly passage as faithfully as the North Star, the stories that take up no space, travel easily, and furnish all that I ever need to feel at home. Until the current debates about multiculturalism and ethnic identity, melting pots and salad bowls, I never gave much thought to this attribute of mine for feeling at home. I took it for granted, as I would my black hair or my flaccid arches, but recently, more and more people have begun questioning me in ways that I had never questioned myself. How do you think of yourself, they want to know? As Chinese or as an American? Without hesitation, I would blurt out the truth, as Bette Bao Lord. Sometimes I imagine the audience sighing with relief. Sometimes I imagine the audience rolling their eyeballs. Until tonight, I never had a chance to fully explain myself. By way of my introduction, you can surmise that I rest my identity with the stories I've lived and the stories I've heard tell. I feel at home as an immigrant. My voyage to America began in the autumn of 1946. I was 8 years old, sporting pigtails, and innocent, not even armed with a passing acquaintance of A, B, or C. To my chagrin, the ocean was not the vast jade lagoon that I had always envisaged, but as about as pacific as a fierce dragon with chilies up its snout. And so I bravely cowered in my bunk, battling to keep down what I had been advised by more learned Chinese was an authentic American delicacy: spaghetti with meatballs. Only yesterday, resting my chin on the rails of the SS Mary Lynx, I peered into the mist for Meiguo, beautiful country. It refused to appear. Then, within a blink, there was the Golden Gate, more like the portals to heaven than the arches of a man-made bridge. Only yesterday, holding my hand over my heart at PS number 8, I stared at the stars and stripes and parroted, "I pledge a lesson to the frog of the United States of America and to the wee puppet for witches' hands, one Asian in the vestibule with little tea and just rice for all." I also parroted the patter on the radio After I had just bolted down a few mouthfuls of syllables, however, my teacher, Mrs. Rappaport, began eliciting my opinions in class. Not only was I stupefied by the challenge of stringing together things like Pepsi Cola hits the spot, I'd walk a mile for a camel, and Hi-O Silver into some coherent thought, but I was amazed that the exalted teacher would solicit the opinion of me, a lowly student fresh off the boat. Teachers in China never did that. Eventually, I came to realize that the merits of one's opinions were not the goal of the exercise. The goal was to nurture a civil society where everyone is free to speak. Today, when political correctness threatens the rigor of our intellectual debates, how I value this aspect of my early education. To me, the cacophony of pudding heads spouting their views is preferable to the clarion call of even the greatest emperor. Only yesterday, rounding third base, I swallowed a barrel full of tears, wondering what wrong I had committed to anger my teammates so. Why were they all madly screaming for me to go home, go home? Only yesterday, listening to Red Barber broadcasting from Ebbets Field, I vaulted over the Milky Way as my hero, Jackie Robinson, stole home. Only yesterday, standing at my grammar school graduation, I felt as tall as the Statue of Liberty, reciting Walt Whitman. I hear America singing, the varied carols I hear, each singing what belongs to him and her and to none else. These yesterdays were no illusion. They number among the stories I tell that bind me irrevocably to America. By the time I arrived at Tufts University, my mother dreamed for me the typical Chinese version of the American dream. It was not to be my son, the lawyer, but my progeny, the ist. Translated into English, that stands for chemist, internist, physicist, biologist, or just about any scientist. And so I majored in how to make a better living through chemistry. To me, it mattered not that in lab I was a bull in a china shop. In class, the empress of bull. To the chemistry department, however, it mattered a lot. And so my professors made me an offer I couldn't refuse. Major in chemistry and flunk, or transfer out and pass. Oh, what ignominy to be the only Chinese in America without an ist. For unbeknownst to us then, I would someday become an ist, a novelist. In another time, another country, failures and mistakes are the makings of tragedy. But for this American, such was the markings on the path to expanded horizons. Until then, I had never studied my mother tongue or my native land. Until then, all I knew had been picked up by osmosis, by clan stories. And so I went to my first China lecture, expecting to see a member of my tribe scribbling at the backboard. Instead, I found a man who looked like, acted like, and even dressed like Mr. Rogers. Soon, my disappointment turned to awe, and I was taught an important lesson. I learned how much learning one can miss if one judged a person's credibility solely by his cover. Dr. Abbott had fallen madly in love with another culture without having had the opportunity to set even a toe in the neighborhood of Asia. His classes were inspiring. I was bewitched. The enchantment endures. At graduate school, a fellow classmate named Winston Lord fell madly in love with my beautiful economic notes. And so for the past 30 years, I've had all the fun of collecting data, deciphering codes, and filling out our joint income tax forms. Ours was an arranged marriage, though obviously not by computer. What dating service worth its software would match a WASP with a Shanghainese? We were, and still are, so very different. I was raised in a family in which having a wonderful holiday meant sitting at a table until we yawned like bagpipes. Winston was raised in a family where bags were packed and ready to go. Before one trip ended, planning had begun for the other. Luggage tags were not only personalized, but color-coded for the instant edification of harried bellhops. At his home, tables were laden with bewildering bibelots from villages with unpronounceable names. Cupboards were jammed with an array of picture-taking equipment that produced everything from lantern slides to photographs in 3D. Thermal gear scientifically tailored for explorers of either pole as well as the equator. Pills to stop, stall, start, or speed alien delectables on their way through the elementary tract. Kits for every emergency, which, if the need ever arose, would take 4 years of medical school to utilize. And indispensable, or was it undisposable, mom and pop bed jackets made out of yak fur cured in the urine of pregnant sows. Despite the differences in our upbringing, we adults gave proof to the adage that opposites do not ipso facto detract, but often attract. Accordingly, after graduation, Winston and I prepared to stage our own version of the drama, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? All went smoothly before, during, and after the meal, until Winston's mother, Mary, whispered something in my father's ear. At once he rose and led her upstairs. My heart pounded. What could they be discussing that they couldn't discuss in front of the rest of us? When Father rejoined the party and Mary remained upstairs, my head pounded. Too cowardly to ask why, I waited for the next act. Each second Mary stayed away seemed like minutes. Each minute seemed like hours. At long last, Mary reappeared, offering not a word of explanation. But even without my glasses, I could see that her eyes were now puffy and bloodshot. Only after the Lords had bid us goodbye did I piece together what had happened off stage. You guessed it, there had been a horrendous cultural clash. Politely, Mary had requested a nightcap. Mystified though he was by such alien ways, Father immediately obliged and showed her to a bed. Mystified though she was by such alien ways, Mary immediately obliged by taking a nice long nap. I feel at home with my in-laws. Unlike mothers of her day, Mary was often away from home. Passports, she warned, must never be allowed to lapse. Be prepared to go anywhere, anytime. And she did. As civilian head of the WACS during the war, as ambassador to the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, and as, of course, just Mrs. Lord. Her civic career was precocious. So were chronic ulcers. At 10, she organized playmates to knit socks for the Allied troops fighting along the Marne. At 10, she also charged the very same playmates a penny admission to watch her perform the bizarre treatment the learned doctors of Minneapolis had devised to ease the agony in her duodenum. Accordingly, she swallowed a length of plastic tubing, only to pull it back out slowly, inch by inch, along with a goodly miasma of breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Armed with a BA from Smith, she began her career as a social worker. Once, when she was dressed in a fancy hat and white kid gloves, her uniform, she scaled up 5 floors to notify an unemployed boxer of an opening as a bouncer. The Hulk opened the door, dressed as he did for his long-awaited debut, 9 months to be exact, on Earth. He was buck naked. In the air, a scent she knew fondly and well, bourbon. He said, "Hey, baby, how about a drink?" She said, "How kind of you to invite me in." Alas, a previous engagement compels me to postpone the pleasure for another day. He stared dumbstruck, and she departed as gracefully as she came, leaving his and her dignities intact. In the 30s, 40s, 50s, and this election year, when society expected all good women to tend the hearth, her career invited constant criticism, but never from those she supposedly neglected, her husband and sons. How they thumped their chest with pride for the woman who hitched a ride on the very first plane to reach Hitler's bunker after VE Day by straddling a leftover bomb, who floated pregnant for 3 days and nights in freezing waters after the SS Mohawk sank, and who ducked bullets as she jotted notes on the coup in Ethiopia. Oswald Lord was so called because his parents, who ultimately had 9 children, didn't want to waste a good name on a sickly newborn. He only weighed 3.5 pounds when he came to this world. But ever since that premature arrival, Oz has been a man ahead of his times. He did it all. With a peripatetic spouse, he lovingly kept the home fires burning, attended the children, and worked overtime at his textile business. He was a true helpmate, while being true to himself. When in her official capacity, Mary was welcoming the Russians at home, he was at the same time picketing their embassy to protest the Soviet invasion of Hungary. When Mary begged Oz not to vent his ire at certain dignitaries she had to befriend at the UN, he graciously granted her the right to edit all the chapters in the book he was writing. But when Exit Backward Bowing was published, words that she had killed were resuscitated in a preface devoted entirely to her dissents. Today, my in-laws have both traveled across the Great Divide. We all miss them so, never more than when there are stories to tell. I feel at home among my Chinese clansman. Wisely, the gods made me wait 27 years before returning to China. For only at middle age was I looking at life from both sides, as mother and daughter, as Chinese and American, as younger and elder, as one person, as a member of the clan, as interested in history as in dreams, no longer thinking that life was without limit and mortality but a word. There I heard the stories of my clansmen, the life I might have led. The year was 1973. The Cultural Revolution, which the Chinese government admits destroyed 100 million lives, was not yet over. My aunt and I were having breakfast at my hotel. I hastened to tell her about my visit to Shanghai earlier that week. It was like a dream, I said. Who could have guessed that I would return to celebrate my 35th birthday in the city of my birth with my own kin? She laughed. Guess, my niece, where I spent my 50th. I could not. She begged me again and again to guess, like a child enjoying some wonderful secret. I guessed. At a banquet. Wrong. On vacation. Wrong. Flashing a wicked smile, she finally told me, in takeoff position. I did not understand. She explained. Betty, I was on a huge stage. In the audience were thousands of students pelting me with slogans, calling me a snake and a cow. My feet were placed together, my body bent at the waist. My arms were raised above my shoulders and behind my back like the wings of a jet plane in takeoff position. And so I remained for 8 hours on my 50th birthday. Her words were matter of fact. The smile never left her lips. Tears jumped into my eyes. No, 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 she shouted. Don't you dare. I never cried. Not a tear. Members of the Bao family never cry. Her pride of family undid what control I had, and the tears flowed. Auntie ignored my shameful behavior and went on, her voice as ebullient as ever. Betty, I laughed out loud when I realized it was my 50th birthday. That gave them a start. They pulled me upright, looked me over to see if I had gone mad. The irony was too much for me. I couldn't stop grinning. They were baffled, and what amused me even more. Someone in the audience shouted, take off, take off. Others took up the refrain. There was nothing to do but obey. Auntie paused only briefly, but her voice no longer had color, and the words trickled out in a flat monotone. And so I placed my feet together, bent myself in two, pushed my arms backwards until they could go no further. I reached for her hand. Quickly she waved it in the air, restored the gleam in her eye, and queried me once more. What do you think happened next? I couldn't think. Betty, like a good Chinese, after a while I got used to it. Oh yes, it's true. I even taught myself to sleep in takeoff position. Once a week, twice a day. What did it matter? I could always use the rest. But I must confess, I was never absolutely at ease in takeoff position, she said, for I feared that I might spoil everything by snoring. Laughter dammed up my tears. This was only the beginning of her story. She was imprisoned in a broom closet for 6 months by those force-fed on Maoist ideology until they had no thoughts of their own. Every morning they would make her kneel, place a steel rod across her calves, and take turns jumping on it. Every afternoon she was compelled to confess her political incorrectness. Her daily ration never varied. 2 buns made out of corn grits, as hard as coal. I asked Auntie the question I subsequently asked all too many Chinese. How did you ever manage to live through that tyranny? I certainly couldn't. Like the others, she replied, yes, you could. Yes, you could. If you had to, you could. In 1979, I saw her again. We were strolling in the park one day when a young man greeted her with a bow. How have you been, teacher? He asked most politely. She returned his greeting. When he had gone ahead, she asked, Betty, do you know who that was? No, I replied. Should I? He was the head of the Red Guards. I started after him. She pulled me back. I wanted to throttle him, take revenge. She laughed at me. Forget the past, she said. I had to live it once. I choose not to live it again and again. It was not my fault. It was not even his fault. Everyone suffered. It was the times. We were all casualties of history. I feel at home with my roots. Otherwise, how could they have inspired all my books? Once, I was deeply saddened to have missed my own grandfather by only 3 short years. And yet, perhaps, if our hands had actually touched and our arms encircled upon homecoming, such happiness would have driven the gods mad with envy. Nothing would have distracted them from a terrible revenge. But the scene never was, and the jealous gods were lulled by the silence of our fateful meeting. Grandfather sleeps in the earth near Suzhou. He has mountains to shelter him from the wind, green farmlands to gaze upon, the shade of a bamboo grove, the vast tranquility of Taihu Lake, and the singing mists just over the horizon. As I stood on that slope, I realized how precious my Chinese roots. They must endure, so that one day, when the children of my children and their children, who don't speak Chinese, look Chinese, or know China, visit this lone ancestor, they will feel Chinese as I did that afternoon at his grave. There I bowed 3 times. I left chrysanthemums and took away serenity for my mother. Americans often ask me, what is the essence of being Chinese? I reply, it is their ability to endure times when wine has turned to vinegar and incense turned to smoke. I recall a Chinese who had been smoking 4 or 5 packs of cigarettes. To no avail had his wife, his mother, his doctors pleaded with him to stop. Then one day he received a letter from his son begging him to do so. Immediately, he stubbed out his cigarette, vowing that it would be his last. He explained, like other men, I fathered a son. Unlike other sons, mine returned to me the gift of life, not just once, but faithfully every day. Anything my son asks, I must grant. The son had been barely 7 when the father was suddenly imprisoned in his own office. There, for years and years, the man remained alone, not knowing why he was a prisoner, when or whether he would ever be freed, what was happening in the world, what had become of all those he cherished. Many a long night, the prisoner contemplated ending it all. But only one certainty stopped him. Every day at dawn, summer, winter, spring, and fall, he could peer through a tiny crack in the boarded-up window and see a snippet of color, a tiny vermilion kite in the sky. Sometimes it hovered at eye level. Sometimes it soared into the heavens. Sometimes it was barely visible. The familiar sight never failed to inspire hope, for the man knew that someone was sending him a message. Someone waited faithfully. Someone cared. And so the father held onto life as tightly as he had once taught his small son to hold onto the tether of his kite. Chinese often ask me, what is the essence of being American? I tell the same story and tout the American tradition of flying vermilion kites. I feel at home representing Uncle Sam. America has granted me many a dream, and even one I've never dared to dream. Returning to the land of my birth as the wife of the American ambassador. At first, citizens of Beijing were astounded to see that the wife of His Excellency Plenipotentiary was not a Westerner, with a tall nose and ghostly skin and bumpy hair colored in outlandish hues. Then, after being my company for a while, they said, "You're a fake foreigner. You're no different from us. You're just a member of the tribe." And I said that everything they said was true. For I do not believe that the loss of one's native culture is the price one must pay for becoming an American. Indeed, I feel doubly blessed. I can choose from two rich cultures, those parts which suit my mood or the occasion best. The road I've taken was cleared by the footfalls of millions and millions of immigrants before me. It led to a room of my own. No doubt I was lucky. Others, sadly, have not been as fortunate. They had little choice but to start down a less traveled road, strewn with broken promises and littered with regrets, haunted by racism and awash with tears. Where could that road possibly lead? Nowhere, but to a nation divided, without liberty, and no justice at all. The contrast is increasingly stark and ironic. The Berlin Wall is down, but between East Harlem and West Hampton, between Chinatown and Tarrytown, the walls go up and up. Has the Cold War ended abroad only to usher a hot war at home? No, I believe we shall overcome, but only if we clear the smoke of ethnic chauvinism and fears, and if we engage the creative resources inherent in our diversity to yield a nation greater than the sum of the parts. And if we honor our mothers and fathers and teachers too, and if we can be as different as sisters and brothers are and belong to the same family, and if we can feel at home in America, all of us feel at home in America. America is a home, no doubt, where skeletons nest in closets and the roof leaks, where foundations must be shored and rooms added, but a home where legacies conceived by our forefathers are tendered from generation to generation to have and to hold. Legacies not of gold and silver, but as intangible and inalienable and invaluable as hope. Hopes are not an illusion. They bind people throughout the world, whatever their origin and race, class, culture, and creed, irrevocably to our common humanity, inevitably to our common destiny. Thus I close with a story of hope. It is from our days in China, when Winston and I attended Christmas service at the reopening of a Catholic church in Beijing. Ahead, flanked by gaudy Chinese pavilions, stands a giant gingerbread house decorated with white icing. In the air, the tolling of bells, badly taped. For a second, I think I'm in Disneyland. But as I study the people, I sense a gravity, an expectancy, a soulfulness, unlike those who gather to be amused. They are pilgrims. The night is cold, the moon is high, we're going to worship. Inside, every inch is taken by people standing on tiptoes and scrunched knee to knee in pews overflowing. Again, the decor is bewilderingly eclectic. Chandeliers that belong in grand hotels, garish paper flowers that bedecked Taoist temples, sorry attempts at stained glass, mosaics reminiscent of mosques, red, white, red, green, and gold trimmings that tint Buddhist halls. Unlike other Catholic churches we visited at home and abroad, this one does not glow with mysterious solemnity, but is intense, almost screaming with light. It is as if the congregation, after 40 years' absence, fears that God might pass them by on this holiest of holy nights. The choir sings hauntingly. The tune is oh so familiar. But Silent Night and Holy Night in Mandarin sounds oh so new. The processional enters. The white gowns on the young altar boys are unhemmed, improvised. Some stop at the knees, some stop at the ankles. A few sweep the floor. And yet there's a dignity about them that years of practice cannot instill. The priests are stooped, frail, and nearly translucent from spending their best years of life in jail. The incense climbing upward toward the floodlights produces that special effect, evoking scenes in movies when the presence of God is here. Surely for most, it is their first time in church. Surely for most, it matters not what is said. It could just as well be from the Torah or the Tao, the Koran or the Sutras, or perhaps even a simple declaration of the people, by the people, for the people. What matters are the intangible tidings cast by a rainbow of hope. I feel at home. Thank you. I would be glad to answer any questions that you might want to ask. Shall I tell you a joke? Once when Winston and I went to see another Buddhist temple, the head monk came out to greet us. And when he saw that I was a writer, when he heard that I was a writer, my husband was the ambassador, he got very, very excited. And he said, "Would you mind doing us a favor?" And we said, "Of course not." And he said, "Would you mind writing something to guide our future visitors?" And we were absolutely thrilled, because this is an honor reserved for emperors, great poets, everybody. So he was starting to think of Kissagerian axioms, and I was thinking of couplets. And finally, the monk came back with 2 beautiful golden boards, and he gave us a pen. He said, "Do you mind doing it in English?" And I said, "No, not at all." He said, "Would you mind writing on this plaque, ladies, and this plaque, gentlemen?" Thank you.
This afternoon, we'd like to welcome Bette Bao Lord to UniverCity, 1992, Coming Home. Mrs. Lord came to the United States as a child, came to Brooklyn, and has spent much of her life in the United States, as well as several years in China as the wife of the U.S. ambassador. Mrs. Lord, would you tell us a little bit about coming to the United States?
I was 8 years old, and I didn't speak a word of English. And we came on a boat that made as many stops as the subway. Finally, after about a month, we arrived in San Francisco, and we took the railroad to Brooklyn. It was wonderful because as a child, it seemed like such a wonderful adventure to be reunited with my father. You see, my father had come to the United States several months before us, so it had been a separation, and I was very, very glad to be there. But on the very first day that I was in America, I got lost. In the morning, my father had showed us to the neighborhood, and I was very, very boastful of the fact that I knew where everything was, including the store. And that afternoon, I volunteered, even though I didn't speak a word of English, to go to the store and buy something for the family. And the adventure side of my parents said, "Go ahead, try it." And I did, and I was promptly lost. So that's when I first got to know the United States Police Department. But things like that became part of the folklore at home. And it is wonderful, fond memories we have of there. My school, my wonderful teachers, and of course the year that I spent there was 1947, when Jackie Robinson broke into the major leagues as the first black baseball player. And he was the hero of everybody at PS number 8. And he really was the vehicle in which I became to feel like an American, because everybody in school knew him and knew how difficult it was for him to play baseball and deal with all the racial prejudices that he found in the ballpark and even among his teams. And yet he excelled. He was Rookie of the Year. And he became my hero. To know that in America, there are doors that will open, and people who are different, like Jackie Robinson and me, will be able to walk through them.
You said that your story of getting lost was part of your family's folklore. Your family has many stories to tell, and you grew up listening to them and then became your own storyteller in your story of Jackie Robinson and the Year of the Boar, and the story of your younger sister's life in China. Tell us a little bit about her life in China when she was left behind.
When we left China in 1946, we were supposed to be gone for only 2 years. And my sister at that time was only 9 months old. So we decided that we should leave her behind and then return to her when she was 3. She would not have known that we had been gone for that long time. But then the Communist Revolution came, and we were in America, and she was there. And it was only 17 years later that we were finally reunited. It was a wonderful scene when I first saw my sister, really, at the airport. She walked out of the plane. It was very odd to see someone who doesn't look like you, but somehow belongs to you, and you feel that even though we had not yet exchanged a word. When we got together and I heard the story of her growing up, I was reminded very much of the story of Anne Frank, in which the whole world learned about what it was like in Germany during the war, in Europe during the war. And I felt that it was important that my sister's story be told. And really it was the fact that I thought that it should be told that I finally ended up being a writer.
Your novel, Spring Moon, was a bestseller and has been published in many different languages. It has been published now in China, I believe?
Yes, it has been published in China.
What about Eighth Moon?
Eighth Moon was supposed to be published in China, but then Tiananmen happened, and it's on hold now.
One of the things that in your biography I read about that interested me, you were co-producer of the Cane Mutiny in Beijing with Charlton Heston.
Yes.
This must have been a very interesting
Yes,
experience.
it was one of those experiences where when I wanted to do it, everybody told me it couldn't be done. First of all, Charlton Heston doesn't speak a word of Chinese, and all the players at the People's Arts Theater in Beijing, the most famous repertory company in China, they did not speak a word of English. And that we would have only 6 months to put on this production. And also that the whole premise of the play, which is about a court-martial and dealing with military law, American military law, was very, very strange to the Chinese audiences. And that they thought nobody would come to see the play. First of all, there was only one set. It was a courtroom, very plain. Everybody would be wearing the same uniform, the military uniform, and that there was no love story and no women and no music and none of the things that would attract an audience to a cross-cultural performance. As it turned out, it was a huge success because it was really about people who are stuck in a situation. In the Cane Mutiny, it was the people, the sailors, who were stuck in a ship that was run by a rather eccentric, if not mad, captain. So I think the people in the audience in China saw that there were parts of their lives that were very much the same as the story in Cane Mutiny. And when it opened, it got tremendous reviews. It toured China. And I understand that at some cities, the scalpers wanted 3 times an average Chinese monthly salary to get a ticket.
The difficult times in China were still going on when you made your first trip home.
Yes.
You visited some of your relatives. Was it really like coming home?
Yes, it was, but not at first, because at first we were always with officials. And then it would be very awkward because they didn't want to say anything wrong. I didn't want to say anything wrong. And we were very polite, but no conversation. But the minute that they left, the officials left, and I was sitting there with my own relatives, of course many of them I had never even met before. But there's something that runs through families that bonds you, and that wasn't broken. And we spent, I think, almost every night of the 6 to 8 weeks that I was in China talking until almost daylight.
Family values have always been very important in the Chinese culture. When, during the Cultural Revolution, when families were separated, when husbands were reporting wives for perhaps their own safety, and children were sometimes turned against their parents, how did the ideals of family continue?
I think the ideals of family continue because it is part of our human nature, our common humanity, that people who care for us when we are young, we care for the rest of our lives. And as the state intruded itself into the family, more and more the family realized how valuable the family is. It had the opposite effect. For many years, they tried to break it up. They tried to make parents distance themselves from the children, and the children report on the family. But in the end, after the crisis, after the many years, everybody came out of that terrible experience realizing how dear and how much they should cherish their family. So in many ways, it had the opposite reaction than what the state intended. As they were trying to break up the family broke up, but it came back together even more solid than it had been before.
And after the most recent problems with Tiananmen Square, this will continue even
I think
stronger?
so, because one of the things that divided the society was perhaps the experiences of the older generation and the younger generation. The older generation, many of them, had given their whole lives to communism and to the revolution and dedicated their time, their energies, everything to the state. And the children saw that, and they were really part of the great group that had to pay for a life dedicated to the state. But after Tiananmen, when the older generation saw how their children and their grandchildren were being fired upon by the tanks and by the soldiers, they realized in a flash that they had dedicated to their lives to something that was not real. And therefore, after that experience, there was even more bonding between the two generations, because they understood the price that was still being paid by the society by having such an authoritarian government.
You have mentioned that education was one of the areas that suffered most. With the great influx of Chinese students to the United States now, and their acquisition of Western ideas, which have been feared in China, how is this going to remold the country?
I think that it's the whole world is changing, so that information from one society to another is reaching a great number of people that we could never imagine that they would reach. I think also with the respect that the Chinese naturally for education, and in this world, especially American education, even the old men who rule China, who are die-hard communists, where do they send their children to school but the United States? So I think that this influence can only grow in China, as when times change and things get better for Chinese in China, many of these students, the 40,000, 50,000 who are studying in the United States, return. They will become a natural bridge of understanding between China and the United States.
As the wife of the American ambassador to China, I know you were asked to perform miracles sometimes in helping people whom you met. Sometimes you had to perform other kinds of miracles in entertaining. Your book, Legacy, is full of delightful anecdotes. Tell us about the Thanksgiving turkeys.
Well, I had a cook that was assigned to me. Many people think the American ambassador's wife is omnipotent, like an empress. Well, I couldn't even hire and fire my cook. So the Chinese government assigned me a cook who probably had never seen a turkey before, unless it was at a zoo. But I had ordered some turkeys for an American Thanksgiving for my guest from the United States, and I gave him instructions. And on the day of Thanksgiving, I came into the kitchen and was so astounded to find that they were just perfect. They were golden brown, and they looked wonderful, and they smelled, the kitchen was fragrant with Thanksgiving. And I was so relieved that I plopped down on a couple of boxes in the kitchen, and I was curious, and I looked down at the boxes, and I said, "What are these?" And I opened up the box, and they looked a little bit like onions, but I didn't order any onions from the United States. And so when I asked the cook, what were they? And he said, "Oh, American onions for your American bird, for your American holiday." And I looked a little bit closer and realized there weren't onions at all. They were hyacinth bulbs that somebody had sent to me from my garden. And so I quickly took the onions and tried to find out whether they were toxic or not. And I ran to the pharmacist, I ran to the doctor, and everybody that day was out of Beijing. Nobody could tell me whether they were toxic. And the only thing I could do was to call the poison center in Atlanta, Georgia. And so I called, and the operator on the other side was so surprised to have a call from Beijing. She started babbling about, oh, I do declare we've never had anybody call us from that far away before. But anyway, the upshot of it was that she said if I could scrape all the stuffing out of the turkey, that I would be able to serve the turkey to my guests. But I have to tell you that I was very nervous throughout the whole dinner because I kept thinking that I might have Jonestown right there in my embassy with everybody collapsing on the floor. We got through it. Everybody had a good time. But the next day, I opened up the papers and there was a huge headline. It said, "Secret New Formula for Curing Cancer," and it was hyacinth bulbs.
You have said that Chinese wear masks all the time. As an American of Chinese descent, living in China, what kind of mask did you wear?
I had to wear, in official capacity, a diplomatic mask. I had to not say some of the things that I wanted to say or object to some of the things that I found objectionable, because I was not chosen by the president to speak his words. My husband's were the policy of the United States. So in that sense, for someone who has a lot of opinions, in official capacity, I was careful not to go against the policy of the United States government. As a woman, sometimes I had to wear a mask and not intrude on some of the cultural differences that are there. For instance, in diplomatic dinners, they sit women together and they sit men together. So many times I found myself sitting segregated, which we're not used to anymore. We used to do that here in the United States too, but we've long given up that. But I think the mask that I had to give up was many of my perhaps more effusive sides, in which I could be naughty, if I could be more myself. But I had to pick and choose the circumstances. Of course, as I learned to know many more people, as they learned, many more people learned to know me. I had wonderful parties in which none of us wore masks. We had disco parties at the embassy. We had American plays at the embassy. We had opera at the embassy, and then I went and knew all the people who performed in Beijing. And once we were talking about the arts, which are such a universal field, it brought us very close. So there were times where I had to wear masks, but there were also times where I could take off my mask.
You were there long enough and made enough close friends that some of them could take off their masks. And that is partially what resulted in legacies.
Yes.
Can you tell just briefly about one of the people who influenced you, who impressed you from taking off his mask?
I had a very dear friend. As I was leaving China, he came in with a present. And I almost grabbed it from his hand. He says, no. You can't have it just yet. You must promise me that when you're away from China and away from me, that when you look at the present, you will not be sad. And I opened it up. It was wrapped up just in newspaper, and didn't have a ribbon or anything. And when I opened it, it looked like a used sheet. And I didn't quite understand what it was. And he said, that is the most precious possession that I have. And it's something that I kept intact, and I kept clean, and I kept whole for 10 years. The minute that he said 10 years, I realized it was his bed cover in jail. When he had been put in jail for from the age of 18 to the age of 28, and 2 or 3 months of that on death row. And he said, you know, in jail, we get about a cup of water a day, and we get hardly anything to a postage-size stamp a month. But I took pride in keeping this bed cover clean and sewn. I would take threads out of my jacket and make a needle out of wire that I had found, and I would sew it up each time. And so I want you to have this, and to think of me, and to think of that experience, not for the 10 years I have lost, but for the fact that even in those 10 years, I could take pride in something I did. And the lesson of this for me was that even in the most horrible, horrible circumstances, there is something in the human soul and the resiliency of people to be able to make some part of their life meaningful to them.
Coming home back to the United States after your 4 years in China, seeing what is happening, has happened in Eastern Europe, what is happening in Somalia, what is your hope for peace, for having a home in the world?
Despite all the problems that we're seeing with the end of communism in Europe, and despite the problems that we see in nature's wrath in Florida, in Africa, I'm very, very hopeful about the future, because I think what is gone today is the debate, the Cold War, and the debate about what is right and what is wrong, whether communism is viable as a ideology for people to live under. Now that is gone. There are new opportunities in the horizon. There's new opportunity with technology and with communications and with understanding. I think if people care, and if people are no longer blinded by communism and by the answers that it offers, we will work harder, I think, to make the whole world much more our home.
Is this hope that you have evident in your current work?
Yes, because I think my current work, which is a novel about China, about 3 friends and their loyalties to one another and to themselves, and the conflict that happens under the last 50 years of communism. I think in the end, because of Tiananmen, so many people were woken up by from the spell of communism, that is the first step in making a new life for themselves, that awakening from the pall of this system that does not value human life and human thoughts.
Thank you very much. I think our time is up. We're certainly happy to have you with us today, and encourage people to read your books and to have the hope that you have on home in the world today.
Thank you.
谢谢。
不客气。